over to you now for questions, contributions, and criticisms. If you disagree, I'm very open to your alternative points of view.
Okay, any questions from the floor? We'll start out here.
So my question is sort of relating to work that we can do within the community. So at this university in 2004 we started as an LGBT society, in 2009 LGBT, and in 2012 LGBTQ. And it's a conversation that's sort of come up time and time again, more and more frequently. I think as we make strides towards equality, is what is the name that's going to encompass us all, sort of include everybody, to put it as loosely as possible, doesn't define as cisgender or heterosexual, that we can all get behind to sort of fight these last fights. I don't know if you have any opinions on the acronym or any possible alternatives.
Well, of course, in the 1990s, the new word was queer, which was to embrace everyone, all non-heterosexual people, bisexual, transgender, questioning, curious, lesbian, gay, and so on. That was the word that was, the short word that was supposed to encompass everyone. It sort of caught on for a while, but has somewhat faded in recent years. And I hate the alphabet soup. I absolutely loathe it. I mean, it's really unfriendly, and the average person doesn't know what it means. I mean, I went to Blackpool Pride for the weekend to support them, and the focus of the campaign was around the abuse of LGBT rights within the Commonwealth. And I had LGBT on the placards, and several people came out and said, "What is LGBT? What are you talking about?" If I put on the Q, the C, and so on, and the I, intersex, it would have been even more confusing. So some people are going for LGBT+, some people are going for LGBTI, some people for LGBTQ. It is so confusing. But I think there ought to be a prize for someone to come up with the proper, correct, well, not proper, correct, but a short, succinct word that covers everything. I mean, in some parts of the world they use the term sexual minorities, which I think is actually better than LGBT and its variations. But that's never caught on here, because it doesn't actually explicitly cover gender identity. It's not about sexual minorities.
In the centre?
You spoke before about how in the United Kingdom in the last 20 years we've gone from one of the most plentiful laws discriminating against LGBTQ, whatever you may call it. I'm interested, then you said that now we're one of the least. But if you look at the European Court of Human Rights, and cases brought by UK residents or other citizens in other member states, the UK is the most regular state that intervenes in a negative sense. If you take the only case to have gone before the court for same-sex marriage, an Austrian case, Shelton Hoff, it was the UK and our lawyers in Whitehall that stood up in Strasbourg and said why it shouldn't be the case, and yet that case was in 2012 during the consultation. So I'm interested, what do you think about the perception that we're kind of leading the way in Europe as one of the first states, or along with some of the other more developed states within the Council of Europe, and yet actually, when it comes down to it, we're not actually on the European level doing the same thing for other European states.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of what the law actually says in Britain, there's been a recent survey which I think Britain was voted the top country in Europe for LGBT laws. So in terms of legal status, our laws are at least some of the best, if not the best, in Europe. But you're right, when it comes to the European Court of Human Rights, the behaviour of our government has not matched that. Not just the Austrian case, but of course, one of the reasons why the government did legislate same-sex marriage is because of the Equal Love case brought in this country, where 4 same-sex couples and 4 opposite-sex couples filed an application in 2011 to overturn both the ban on same-sex civil marriage and opposite-sex civil partnerships. And basically the Conservative government realised or suspected that there was a possibility that the European Court might rule that this ban was, or both bans, were unlawful. Because unlike Austria, in Britain, civil partnerships and civil marriages are very, very similar. And so they're not so similar in Austria. You know, the civil marriage and civil partnerships are different in Austria. But in Britain they're not. And that was the basis, based I think on the Mariko judgment earlier, that led the government to suspect that it might actually be forced by Europe to change the law. And David Cameron and his advisors calculated that would be very bad because it would be used by UKIP and by the Eurosceptics within the Conservative Party to undermine the government. So they took the view that given there was a likelihood they would lose the case, that we would win, better that they, you know, were seen to be leading the case for change. And of course, you know, at the end of the day, that undermined the case, and we have yet to have a definitive judgment on the issue in the European Court of Human Rights. I certainly think that the momentum is moving all across Europe towards marriage equality. And as you probably know, the European Court of Human Rights, one of its factors or one of its considerations is whether or not there is a consensus within Europe on an issue. So, for example, it didn't rule in favour of LGBT people serving the armed forces in the 1980s. One of its arguments was that there wasn't a consensus in Europe, that only a relatively small number of European countries allowed LGBT people to serve, and therefore it shouldn't preempt you know, the decisions of other nations. With marriage equality, it's still a relatively small number, given the nearly 50 member states of the Council of Europe, but it's moving in that direction. And I think inevitably, eventually, it will rule in favour of marriage equality and make that mandatory, or indeed the European Union, rather than the Council of Europe, may make that move, as they did on workplace discrimination.
What do you think the reasons behind the reluctance of the political establishment to combat blatant racism, misogyny and homophobia of the rise of the far right is?
Well, I think the reason, I think the big three parties, Labour, Liberal Democrat and Conservative, are very much of the view that politics is their domain. They discount smaller parties and social movements until it becomes an issue that has got, you know, big public profile and is a big news story. And then and only then do they react. I think that the attempt to UKIP is a big mistaken one, because it's pandering to that agenda. You know, I don't think UKIP will be defeated by mirroring or going towards their agenda. That will just give them further strength that they've made an impact and forced change. I think the way to challenge them is to come up with the alternative policies that can undermine support for UKIP. And I think it is, in part, a series or long period of failure by the three major parties to address social injustice and inequality, and in particular the marginalisation of working class communities, that has allowed UKIP, even to some extent the BNP, to gain traction. There is no doubt that working class communities in this country have been screwed by successive governments. I mean, just look at the amount of house building, or the lack of house building, over the last 3 decades. It is truly, truly scandalous that so few new social houses have been built in this country. And that's why we have a housing crisis. It's why people feel aggrieved when they see the allocation system not operating fairly. And I think, you know, the way to undermine UKIP is to invest in good housing, employment, the health service, people who feel that their needs are being addressed, who feel that the parties in power or the opposition really care about them, they're going to be much less inclined to vote for UKIP. And I think also you will find that many people, of course, have bought into the kind of lies put out by UKIP or the scare stories put out by UKIP and the Daily Mail and so on. You know, they need to be challenged. And, you know, by and large, they've not been challenged. By and large, you know, the main three parties have given a nod to the kind of ideas and, you know, scare stories that UKIP has put out. They haven't robustly challenged, and that has given UKIP the space, and indeed the BNP previously, the space to gain traction and support.
Down in front.
This sort of actually was kind of tangential to what you were talking about earlier with actually loud housing. But I really like what the section where you talk about sort of bullying, bullying in schools, and the fact that LGBTQ children feel sort of alienated from by their peers and also by the family, sometimes often just right out that. And sort of, I often find the next step from that is sort of not often talked about, i.e. they often drop out of schools, and they often get kicked out of their homes, and they're homeless. And I'm just wondering, because the amount of homeless people, the portion of them that are LGBT is higher than the portion of LGBT people in the country. It's kind of a shocking match. Because of that, do you believe that the LGBT community should be campaigning so that homelessness isn't a problem, should be campaigning so that policies which target those vulnerable are scrapped, and that the most vulnerable and are protected?
You're right, the rates of homelessness among particularly young LGBT people is much higher than the national average, and indeed the proportion of LGBT people in the population. And there are organisations like the Albert Kennedy Trust, which provides housing and support for homeless LGBT youth. There's also Stonewall Housing, does very good work for housing issues for younger and older LGBT people. But both organisations are seriously underfunded. And of course, with the austerity measures of the government, funding and support for lots of LGBT organisations, and indeed other very good, commendable voluntary organisations, has been cut back. You know, that means that the service that needs to be provided isn't being provided. And you know, we know that you know, so many young people who are LGBT people have major problems, as you said, about being kicked out of home by parents, facing sometimes difficulty if they're in shared houses of multiple occupation with other tenants who are homophobic or transphobic. It is a really big issue, and it sort of goes back to the issue of we don't have enough social housing in this country. And of course the selling off of council houses was a very major factor in that, as well as the failure to build new council houses. In terms of, you know, young people and homelessness, it's very interesting that the Albert Kennedy Trust, I don't think they've publicly said this, but I know from personal conversations, they say that the highest request rate on their housing support facilities come from Muslim young LGBT people and from Afro-Caribbean young LGBT people. Now, it's not that all people in those communities are homophobic, but there is a problem with homophobia in significant proportions of the Muslim and Afro-Caribbean communities, which does lead to a disproportionate number of LGBT people from those communities ending up homeless. I don't know what the exact figure is, but I think more than half of all the young homeless people who go to Albert Kennedy Trust are from Afro-Caribbean and Muslim communities. So, you know, in a sense, the Albert Kennedy Trust is picking up the sort of casualties of homophobia at home. I think the government needs to do much more to help educate, you know, parents and young people about their responsibilities towards their children and their brothers and sisters. And that's why the equality and diversity lessons, although perhaps they can't change the attitudes of adults who are out of school, perhaps can hopefully begin to change the attitudes of young people who will be the future adults and the future parents.
I find it interesting that you talked about the fact that there's two marriage laws. So would your suggestion to be to instead of to have a new marriage law for both parties, for same-sex marriage and for opposite-sex marriage, because you can understand their thinking of why something that's been there since the 1940s, why would you change it? But would you say to just make a new one, generic one for everybody? That would be your suggestion.
Now my argument was, we don't need any new law, we just need the reinstatement of the 1949 Marriage Act. The 1949 Marriage Act does not stipulate that marriage partners have to be male or female. There's no prohibition on same-sex marriage in the 1949 Marriage Act. That ban was only introduced in 1971 under the Nullity of Marriage Act, which was passed explicitly to stop LGBT couples, in particular transgender couples or partners, from marrying the person they love. So the ban on same-sex marriage has only existed for 43 years. When people say there's always been a ban, that's nonsense. It's not true. So I'd argue all the government needed to do was to amend the 1970s law and revert to the 1949 Marriage Act. But the government felt that would be too controversial. They said, no, we can't do that. We need a whole new legislative framework. So they took months and months and months to devise a whole new legal framework, where they could have simply passed, you know, a 2-line amendment to repeal the ban on marriage from the 1970s and revert it to the 1949 Marriage Act. They would have to maybe make a few other, you know, ancillary changes to other secondary legislation, but that could have been done quite simply. So instead they went for a very complicated, convoluted, arcane approach, completely and totally unnecessary. But in terms of the future, I would argue that same-sex marriage and same-sex civil partnerships are essentially the same. Slight differences, different names, but essentially the same. Civil partnerships are based on the marriage model. So whether you're talking about opposite-sex relationships or same-sex relationships, civil partnerships and civil marriages, which should be open to everyone, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, basically they're the same. Let's have an entirely new relationship framework. If we were starting from scratch, I don't think we'd invent the marriage model now. I think we'd come up with something different. And I've proposed for the last 20 or 30 years what I've called a civil commitment act, which is different both from marriage and from civil partnerships. Under my proposal, under the Civil Commitment Act, anybody could nominate any significant other person in their life as their next of kin and beneficiary. So it could be a partner, or it could be a lifelong best friend, a favourite niece or nephew. It gives people choice. I don't think next of kin status and the tax advantages with regard to inheritance that accrue to civil partnerships and marriages should be restricted to people in relationships. That's discrimination against single people. I think everyone should be able to have a tax advantage of passing on a certain amount of their property free from inheritance tax. That to me is the right thing to do. But not a certain extent, they should be able to pass on their property without any inheritance tax as a married couple or a civil partnered couple can do. The second element of my proposal is that when it comes to people in relationships, in a relationship, they should be able to pick and mix from a menu of rights and responsibilities. Now, at the moment, under marriage law and civil partnership law, it's one size fits all. You know, there's the law states this is it. This is what you get. You just sign on the dotted line. It doesn't take into account the many different models of relationship and lifestyle in modern society. So, for example, some people in love live together, some live apart. Others share their finances, some maintain financial independence. Some couples have children, others don't. So what I'm trying to suggest is, let's have a model of relationship recognition and rights that allows people to pick and mix from a menu of rights and responsibilities to create their own tailor-made partnership agreement, suited to their particular circumstances. That to me would be a much more modern, democratic, flexible system. It would take into account the variety, the complexity, the diversity of different relationships. I'm sure when it comes to the details, greater minds than mine can work out the particularities and cross all the T's and dot all the I's. Like that basic principle of people being able to pick and mix from a menu of rights and responsibilities is probably the way to go. And it would have one very important practical advantage. When you get married or have a civil partnership, the document is presented to you and you sign. All the rights and responsibilities are set out there. There's no negotiation. Under my system, a couple would have to go through all the rights and responsibilities and sign each individual one, jointly sign it. So couples would have to negotiate each different right and responsibility. And that, I think, would bring home to them the responsibilities into which they're entering. And perhaps, hopefully, make for wiser, more important decisions about getting together.
Right at the back there.
Do you support the legalisation of polygamy, since a lot of the arguments in favour of gay marriage could easily be applied to that issue?
I don't think there's an issue right now, but of course I think in principle there ought to be a debate about it. I have 3 friends who last November celebrated 25 years together. They have been in a 3-person relationship for 25 years. They're very happy about it. It works for them. They love each other just as much as any married or civilly partnered couple. I can't see any moral objections. I can't see any practical objections. I think there's surely some way around that to ensure that people in that situation do have rights and responsibilities towards each other and a legal framework to protect them. We haven't really had a proper debate about it, but I think we need to. And I think you use the word polygamy, which is usually associated with a particular person, a man having many wives, but I think the term should be multiple relationship recognition, because it shouldn't be about it could be 2 men and 1 woman, it could be 3 women, it could be 3 men. The permutations are manifold. But I think in principle we ought to have a discussion about it. And as I said, I think if people are happy in a 3-way relationship or a 4-way relationship or a 5-way relationship, why not? A democratic society respects the rights of the people within it. And unless they're doing harm to others, I can't see any clear justification for denying them that right.
If you go right at the back, over there by the fire doors.
What kind of importance would you place on changing the way we do sexual education in this country? Like, I know for a fact that in my case, I was taught about heterosexual schools and nothing else, whereas I think that if just a lot of people, like say, I've spoken to people and they've said that they didn't know they were asexual until they didn't know that was a term, they didn't know anything about it. Do you think it would help both with people not discriminating against them because they're educated and just with stopping suicide rates, for example, because people know what they are, they know from the start, they're not confusing.
Well, one of the drawbacks of equality is that it implies or suggests acceptance of the status quo, that you merely want equal rights within what exists. But what exists is often deeply flawed. So when it comes to sex and relationship education, I think straight young people are badly dealt by just as much as young LGBT people. I mean, the level and quality of sex and relationship education in this country is truly appalling. You know, with some exceptions in some schools, but for most schools, it is really, really failing young people. Sex and relationships, for most adults, are two of the most important things in their lives. You know, the person you love and share your life with, the emotions, the feelings, and the sexual fulfillment, it's very, very, very important to most people's lives. Yet, sexual literacy and emotional literacy are not even really on the agenda. You know, if a school is there to help prepare young people for life, then just as important as mathematics and English, history, and so on, sex and relationship education should be there. As you know, right now, it's not compulsory, and parents have a right to withdraw their children. Well, you know, parents don't have a right to withdraw their kids from history lessons or geography or science. Why should they have the right to withdraw their kids from sex and relationship education? That's parents imposing their will on their children before those children are mature and able to make their own decisions. Just because you give someone sex and relationship education doesn't mean to say they're going to become, sexually licentious or, emotionally incontinent. I mean, that is not the case. The evidence is that when you give young people good quality sex and relationship education, including about LGBT sexuality and relationships, people tend to respond, young people tend to respond very well, very maturely, and the end result is that they often delay their first sexual experience till they're older, and when they do, they're more likely to practice safer sex, to protect against unwanted pregnancies and HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. So the experience in the Netherlands is a very positive one. There they've had a campaign around, it's your body, or it's my body, it's my body. And under that education mantra, young people are taught all kinds of quite explicit things about sex and relationships, and then they're allowed to make their own choices. And indeed, until recently, the age of consent with certain qualifications in the Netherlands was 12, which may seem very shocking, but the reality was, with this good sex and relationship education, the average Dutch young person had their first sexual experience at a later age than the average British person. So, good sex and relationship education is very important and fundamental to good, healthy, happy sexual and emotional relationships in later life. So I wouldn't allow parents to withdraw their children, or at least I would impose a system whereby parents who don't want their kids to have sex and relationship education should have to come to the school for each individual lesson and then physically take their child out. Apparently, of all places, it's been tried in some schools in Northern Ireland, and it's resulted in a massive reduction in parents withdrawing their kids from sex and relationship education. So I think, sometimes we can learn from Northern Ireland.
We'll go here, and then the question after this will be the last one. If you've got a good one, then stretch your hand up.
The mayor of the
small Welsh town from which I hail, has recently become involved in what looks to be quite a landmark case in the European Court of Human Rights, after the UK Human Rights Commission said that he could not restrict double bedrooms in his hotel to married couples, as he then did. Although I strongly disagree with his opinion and with his motivations for this. Yeah, I think you definitely touched on it. But what do you see as the dynamic that should exist between obviously the motion of the reduction of bigotry and people's freedom to express within business premises that they own their individual thoughts?
But of course, under British law nowadays, if you provide a public service, you are prohibited from discrimination on any ground. The idea is to ensure that there is no discrimination. If we weren't discussing the case of a same-sex couple, if we were discussing the rights of Asian or Muslim people to have equal access, the vast majority of people would say this isn't even a question for debate. Of course, discrimination against Asian or Muslim people should be prohibited, even if the owner of the business has a moral objection to Asian or Muslim people. So, in many cases, the people who take this stance against same-sex couples do so on the basis of their Christian faith. Yet, if they were discriminated against as Christians, they'd be screaming blue murder. They'd be hovering from the high rafters if anybody refused them a bed and breakfast because of their Christian faith. And quite rightly, discrimination against Christian people, or people of any faith or no faith, is fundamentally wrong. So if we want to live in a cohesive society where there are good community relations and where everyone feels secure and respected, where people are treated equally, we do have to have a clear blanket system of no discrimination. Once you grant one exception, then you open the door to others. Extreme Judaists discriminate against Muslims. You may have people in supermarkets who are Jewish, hold an extreme Jewish view, refusing to handle pork or alcohol or whatever. There are a whole range of different kinds of exclusions and justifications that people can use based on their politics or their faith. I don't think we should give them that license, because it means in the end that we will become a fragmented society where vast numbers of people in society will face discrimination by extremists in certain sectors of society who happen to own businesses or who work in businesses. If you work in a business, if you're employed by a supermarket to do a job, even if that supermarket serves alcohol and you disagree with alcohol, you have a duty to provide it. If you can't provide it, of course I respect your right, but you need to go and get a different job where you're not faced with that moral dilemma.
And last question, we'll go there.
We've talked a lot about equal marriage in this country, but obviously there's still one part of the country that doesn't have equal marriage, and that's Northern Ireland. Given the opinion of the DUP, and I still remember your appearance on Question Time with the delightful Ian Paisley Jr., what are the prospects for equal marriage in Northern Ireland in the near future?
But of course, this is one of the downsides of devolved power. Northern Ireland, like Scotland and Wales, has devolved government. And marriage is one of those issues where the devolved government has the power. So, of course, I want to preserve the principle of devolution, which I think is a good one. I'd like to see it extended to the English regions as well, I might add. But nevertheless, that discrimination does need to be challenged and is being challenged by other political parties in the north of Ireland, most notably Sinn Féin, but with some other support as well. Plus, of course, from the grassroots LGBT community there and other human rights and equality organisation. Sadly, DUP has the hand at the moment. It won't last forever, and we need to support those people in the north of Ireland who are pressing for change. Not just on this issue, but on quite a few other issues as well. I think it's really sad that the DUP has so much support within sections of the Protestant Loyalist community, given its retrograde views on quite a number of issues, including sexual relationship education in schools. But that ultimately is going to be a battle that people in the north of Ireland have to fight. All we can do is to support them.